I'd like to look at a rubric for grading question 5 on the AP Statistics exam from 2005. I'm going to assume you've already read the question, and so if not, pause it and do that. We'll go ahead and start with Part A. It says, for this survey, state one potential source of bias and describe how it might affect the estimate of the proportion of adult heads of households in the United States who do not have a high school diploma. First of all, notice it said state one potential source of bias. There's no sense in doing 2 or 3 or 4, because if you miss anything on that, you're going to end up missing the points. So one answer is here. Since random digit dialing will be used, individuals without phones will not be included in the sample. People without high school diplomas are more likely to have lower paying jobs and may not be able to afford a phone. Therefore, the estimated proportion of adult heads of households in the U.S. without a high school diploma may be less than the true population proportion. Now, as we go through this, if I speak too fast or you need to look at what you've done, pause the video and do that. The grading looks like this. It's essentially correct if you provide a source of sampling or non-sampling bias and link to whether or not you have to link that bias to whether or not they have a diploma, and you describe the impact on the survey correctly. So you have to talk about the source of bias, link it to why that would matter with a diploma, and describe the impact on the survey correctly. So here's a few other examples they gave us. Number one, wording of the question or maybe the tone of the interviewer may make the caller less likely to reveal that they don't have a high school diploma. That's not a sampling bias. That's another bias, forcing the estimate to be too low. So I make someone feel bad for not having a diploma, perhaps. Number two, calls may be made during the day when individuals with diplomas are at work. So there could be an over-reporting of individuals without high school diplomas. That's sampling bias, because I'm getting some people who are not available to be in the survey because they're gone. In this case, the estimate's too high. Number three, maybe the higher educated people have caller ID and don't want to answer the phone when they see it's a survey phone, giving me too high of an estimate. Or number four says, since people who don't like to respond to cold calling, the response rates may be low, so the survey results are not useful at all. The impact of the bias on this estimate is not clear one way or another. Part A is partially correct if you provide a sample or a source of bias linked to whether or not you have a diploma, but you don't describe how it's going to affect the survey. Or you have a possible source of bias, but you make a mistake in how you describe it, and the impact of this on the survey is consistent. That's a partially correct, so it's got a minor error. And it's incorrect if the source of bias is not reasonable for this survey, or you haven't connected those dots. Part B says, let's go back to the question. Part B says, previous studies indicate 22% of the people don't have high school diplomas. Using this information, how many people do we need to survey to get 95% confidence with a 0.03 margin of error? So they set up the formula right here. All of this is the margin of error. 0.03, the Z star for 95% is 1.96, and this P star is my guess for what P is. That's 0.22. They solved this for N and got this value, which we then have to round up. In the rubric, you'll see a couple other things that may have gone on here. It's essentially correct if you've got the critical value, the margin of error, and the standard deviation. You could use 0.22 or 0.5, and the work is shown, and the numeric response is rounded up. Other essentially corrects, if you've worked it out like this, which is basically the same thing, or you use the conservative approximation with P star is 0.5, you would actually get 1,068. We didn't do the Wilson approach, so you wouldn't have that on there. Part B is partially correct if work is shown with no more than one of the following errors. Wrong critical value, you didn't use 1.96. Wrong margin of error, you didn't use the 0.03. Wrong standard deviation, so that square root portion is wrong. Or you rounded down or didn't make it an integer. That's also a problem. If you did only one of those and showed work, you can get credit. Otherwise, incorrect. And now looking at part C, it says, since education is largely the responsibility of each state, the agency wants to be sure the estimates are available for each state as well as the nation. Identify a sampling method that will achieve this additional goal, and briefly describe a way to select the survey sample using this method. So here's an answer for C. To achieve the goal, we should use a stratified random sample by taking samples within each state. Each individual state is a stratum. Within each state, we could take a random sample of heads of households, select them and survey them. The sample size within each state would be based on the desired precision. Data from the individual state should be combined to obtain the national estimate. Now, you may not say all this stuff, but I'm showing you examples of good, complete conclusions according to the College Board. This is essentially correct if you identify stratified sampling. The student must indicate the states or the strata, using a word like strata or stratified is great, and that you still take a random sample within each state. We still have to have a random sample even when I take a stratified sample. It's partially correct if you only mention one of those. So you talked about strata but not random, or vice versa. It's incorrect if you do something else, including suggesting that we continue to call until we get enough people from each state. That's an incorrect response for what we have here. Now again, if you need to pause it and go back and identify the essentially correct, partially correct, or incorrect for each part, do so now. Then find the essentially corrects and partially corrects according to this table, and they get the appropriate grade or the corresponding grade over here. Be sure your name is on the paper that you graded, and put this score in a box at the top of the page.